Hi there, my name is Helen McKnockiter. I'm a painter and an illustrator, and I'm local here to the Scottish borders. I'm here today to show you how I would do an illustration with organic materials such as red wine, coffee and tea. For me, painting and illustrating is such a meditative process. It sort of takes you out of your head and all you can do really is draw and paint. So I feel like it's a mindfulness that everyone should sort of try and incorporate. And by using these materials that you find every day in your house, I think that it makes it a little bit more accessible to you. So let me start by showing you how they would look. So when these materials have dried, they have lovely sort of sepia tones. So this here was made using the red wine. These are 2 pucker teas, so this is like a dinner tea, and this is a turmeric tea. This is just plain Tetley tea, and here we've got instant coffee. And what I do to begin with is I make myself a background. So for this here, this is Honesty, which is this plant here. And what I've done is I started with the turmeric tea, and that's the very light sepia shades. I then put in some darker accents by using like the Tetley tea, the red wine, and then when that had dried, I then put coffee over the top. So I think what I'll do first of all is I will show you on this piece of paper how I would make a background which would then dry to look a little bit like this. So what I need is paintbrush, and I'm going to I've brought my Tetley, I've got my coffee, and I've got the red wine. So I'm going to start with the tea because the tea is the lightest shade and tone. And basically, what I also like about painting using this technique is it's quite organic. Like you almost can't. I mean, you can control the shape. Like if you wanted to paint a particular shape, you can. For example, here I've done the Honesty, but a lot of the time you can't really, like with this particular piece here, I didn't really have a shape in mind when I started. I mean, I painted in the grass after, but you sort of adjust your drawing to fit the shape, if that makes sense. So I'll start by just putting my tea on really loosely. It doesn't matter, it's not. Now, and if you spatter it, I think that just adds to the effect. I quite like it. And there's no way to make a mistake with this kind of illustration. I just think it's a lot of fun. So here I'm going to add some coffee accents, and you just do it sort of where you might like it to be slightly darker. And it's a little bit like watercolour in a way. It sort of mixes and blends itself in together. And it just almost has like a really sort of old-fashioned look to it, which I find very appealing. Right, and I'll just add some red wine to get some nice purple tones. And obviously you can dilute. When I made these drinks, obviously the red wine is just normal red wine. The tea was sort of 4 tea bags in just a little bit of water in a cup, and the coffee probably 4 heaped teaspoons, and a little. So I like mine quite strong, but you can dilute it like if you wanted slightly more subtle shades, although I do feel like quite a lot of the time it is quite subtle. You have to make it quite strong. But if you wanted like more, it to be like a darker purple colour at the end, you just add more red wine to that. I mean, it takes quite a long while to dry. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. I'm going to put that to the side. So that's how I would do that. So this is a similar sort of thing when it's dry. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add some very organic floral stem type shapes using coffee. So all I do here is sort of, you want like quite substantial drips, so you just get a quite concentrated bits of coffee. It can be quite random essentially, that's the way you put it, because the thing about like flowers in meadows and gardens is that the planting is often quite sporadic, and that's quite nice. And then we'll do some flicks. So really, I think it's more about playing and sort of seeing what it is that, and then what I would do is just pour it off. So there's my stems essentially, but that's going to dry quite light. So what I then like to do is just reinforce by just dipping the coffee back on where I had, and it'll just sort of dry in a better way. Okay. And here's one that I did earlier that has been dried. And what I quite like about this one is, so this is now, I can now draw on this, but it does need to be dry first. Otherwise, you could use inks on your wet if you wanted to incorporate some colour. But if you wanted to just draw with a pen, then you really need it to be dry. But what I quite like about what's happened in this one is it's almost like a natural leaf shape has formed. So I think I'll definitely be making that into a leaf. And these are quite good as like daisy heads, I think, so I'll be making those into daisies. So I'm going to start with my leaf shape. You can't get it wrong, it's about interesting mark making. So, you know, lines, dots, dribbles, you know, stuff like that to me, well, that's what makes me happy when I look at other artwork. I'll just introduce some shadow. But you can be quite scribbly, you know, as long as you keep it within the... I quite like working in fine liner because you can really sort of see the marks, but if you wanted to really mix it up a little bit, let's make it quite thick. Let's see, 0.8. But you could even, you know, use biro for this. Like if you don't have fine liners in your house, biro will work very well for it. It'll be fine. I just think it's the art and the process of making it that's the main thing. Like I think we need to get over the fact that like it's like you know, making good art, but I think making art, any kind of art, is really good for you mentally. And you know, as well, it's about not being worried of the blank page and not be worried about making mistakes. It's like having a go, and I'm going to try and get some flower petals in to sort of show you that. So every sort of splodge can become a flower head, and every line, a stem, anything that looks like a leaf can be a leaf. It's about using your imagination really, and adding shadows where you know there's going to be shadows. Right, so I might show you now how I might add a little bit of colour if I wanted to. In this piece here, I've used quite a lot of colour to get some of the shapes of the flowers that I wanted to get. So I will just... And what I've been using for that is just these pens. They're sort of like a fine liner, but in colour. So I've got pink here, and I might make it just look a little bit like a cosmos. So... And if you start to add some colour and you feel like perhaps it's slightly garish and you're not feeling it, what you just can do is just go over with the tea, because the tea is the lightest shade, and it makes it kind of blend more back into the piece. And so you can work quite often in layers to sort of create what it is that you want to create, and if something's not working, it's almost like it takes it out a little bit, it bleeds it out, it makes it not look quite as intense. So this would be quite a good floral shape. Get a little bit of a darker one to show some, very dark, to show some shadows, a little bit darker than I expected, but there are no mistakes. You basically just get your tea and sort of go over it again. And you can spread that colour as well, just to sort of incorporate it into your picture. Another thing I like to do is just pick out little bits, like maybe just little bits of stem, just as a way to sort of introduce more colour to your piece. Yeah. And you know, when you're doing it and it looks ugly and you think this shouldn't work, keep at it, keep trying, because a lot of the time, a lot of pieces will go through a bit of an ugly stage, and then sort of you can pull it back. And I think I will leave that one like that. And I quite like how the inks will run into each other and the tea will run together, and it just creates this lovely, like, messy sort of interesting illustration. So another thing we can do is, when we're at the wet stage, we can add colour. And the best way to do that is with ink. So I've got some Indian inks here that I'm going to try and use. So I'm going to start with like quite a goldy yellow one. I quite like to use, I've got a bamboo pen, and it's absolutely fabulous for ink. You can add a drop, and then and you can sort of use your pen to even, so if you wanted to incorporate a little bit of colour into your piece, into your background, Indian ink is quite a good way to do it. And I quite like the way it sort of then blends in itself. So you can be quite bold, and you can add whatever inks you want, and if you wanted to move it about the page, it'll sort of stay within the confines of your original painting, hopefully. You can sort of mix them together and yes, and you can get some really good effects. But the whole point of this technique, I think, is about sitting, having a play, and just having fun with it, and you'll end up with some really interesting work. And even if, like, you know, 80% of it's not usable, you often end up with a few pieces that you really love, or a few bits or ideas to take forward. So also I've got these watercolour pencils, and they are fantastic for adding colour to the piece. And what I would do with these is sort of find an edge. So this would be something that you would do before you start adding your detail, before you start adding your pen. And if you're doing this, it's about adding layers and textures and just areas of interest, really. And it's about, like, happy mistakes as well. Taking a mistake and making it into something that's really interesting and different. Then you add your tea, and it just creates this sort of something that you can then, once this is dried, go on with the pen again to add the details and the fine lines and the best thing about flowers is they're so forgiving. You can't, you know, it's difficult to get them wrong, because they often do have, like, strange and weird shapes and colours and sizes, and yeah. So then that's something that you would then put to the side and you could work on again later with the pens. Okay. So this one here I have done using, it was red wine and tea as a background. And obviously I started with like bizarre shapes, and then I've made them into hedgerow plants, dying hedgerow plants, because that's sort of the time of year that we're in, and I quite like the seasonal aspect of that. But also there's like a beauty in it, you know, in the death of plants. They still keep their structure and their shape, and they've got some really interesting, and I think interesting shapes, but also the colours are quite sepia, so it works quite well with this medium. So I'm going to try and show you how to do something a little bit like that. And I have a tea and coffee and red wine painting I've done of the Honesty. So this is Honesty here, and I quite like the way it's like translucent seed pods are absolutely beautiful and perfect for this here. So what I've done here is I've painted the shapes already. So I didn't do random stuff like I have done with this particular piece. I knew I wanted to do Honesty. I knew what the shape was. I looked at the plant and I've painted it with tea. What you could do if you wanted to, and what I do sometimes, is I will draw with a very light pencil underneath, and I'll sort of then paint over the top of it. And so you do have like some idea, and you know what you're going to draw over the top. But for this one I just freehanded it, but you can use pencil if you want to. Because you're going to draw over it, it doesn't really matter. So here I am again, I've got my Pilot fine liner pen. I'm just going to have a little look at the Honesty. I'm going to add some of the details in here. I like to draw quite quickly with this because I don't want to be bogged down in details. I don't think that's particularly interesting. I like when it's got like a slightly unfinished sort of look to it. So it's about like using quite a mixture of like mark making. You know, you do your parallel lines, and you can use it like quite scribbly and just try and make lots of different marks, because that's what keeps it interesting. But not every single line needs to be defined as well. Some of it's quite nice. It's quite nice if you work with the definition, and also in some cases let it still have that sepia colour of like the tea or the coffee. This time of year as well is really great for foraging for different and interesting looking plants. Like we've got quite a few different shapes. This is just from a walk I did yesterday, and I quite like the way they're like a bit bent and a bit snapped and a bit like looking a bit worse for wear, because I just think that represents like the time of year that we're in at the moment, and the change in seasons. So there's another mindful practice, getting out for a walk while you're looking for your interesting things to draw. Quite like how the more coffee you add as well, the more sort of this, you get this like sort of almost, I don't know if you can see it in the light, but it becomes quite shiny. You get this extra added patina to it. And I have been asked before if, if it fades over time, but I think this picture here, I mean, I did it in April of 22 and it hasn't faded at all. And but what I've started doing is just sort of when I'm completely done and it's all completely dry, giving it a little spray of like a matte varnish, just to make sure, but it does, the coffee and tea and white, it doesn't seem to fade. Obviously, probably over like a large amount of time, it maybe would, but which is why I've started doing the varnish over the top, just to sort of make sure that that doesn't happen. And I mean, I suppose you could add colour to it if you wanted to, more colour. I quite like the sepia black and whiteness myself, but you could even add details sort of between the leaves. You could have stripes up the piece, you could have whatever it is that would make you happy. But I quite like the simplicity of it, because I think honesty is quite a nice, simple sort of flower plant, and yeah. So there's another way that you can use the pigments, the natural pigments. You can draw first. So this is something that I've drawn based on that I drew plein air outside in the hedgerow, you know. So we've got plants in various stages of decay. And I've used, what you can do as well, if you want to sort of pep it up, you can use nice papers. This is a handmade paper from Tide Kettle. There's a shop in Bergpont-Tweed, and you can order them online. And she puts lovely little bits and pieces in the paper, so it has this like gorgeous texture. And that's another way to add interest to your drawings, by having lovely paper. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to I suppose decorate it, just make it look a little bit more interesting, and I'm going to use my 3 pigments that I've got to do that. So I'm going to start with coffee, I think, and I'm just going to give the drawing a little bit of background interest. Now these pens that I've used, these fine liners, are great because they do not bleed when you add, so they're Unipin fine liners. They don't bleed when you add liquid to them, so the drawing should keep it, because the other ones would definitely bleed, which can also be a really, really nice look. But if you don't want it, if you want to keep the integrity of your drawing, you just... So again, like, you know, just being really rough with it, just because there's nothing, you can just... There's no way you can do it wrong, really, essentially. So I quite like that, but what I'm going to do is, let it drip off. Keeping the shapes quite organic, and I think we will use some red for the remains of a flower over here. Coffee up here. This is quite a nice evening activity, because as you're painting you can also have a nice glass of red wine with you, because the smell of it's lovely. Now, because this Tide Kettle paper, it's not as thick, like this watercolour paper is 300 grams. It's not quite as thick, so you will get some rippleage, but all you would have to do is sort of, when it's dry, put it under a heavy book, and it'll be fine. And there, that would just about do it. And I think I'm going to let this dry over here. So this is one of the first techniques I used when we introduced colour. With the fine liner coloured pens. It's got a coffee background, and then I just sort of drew on top of it. And with this one I didn't actually put more tea over the top, it sort of just stayed as is. And over here I have an illustration which has just got a plain coffee background, and then we've just drawn over it with pen. And then over here is what I've done in this video, and I used different teas to create my background, and then I've drawn Honesty seed pods over the top. Here is, this is a painting whereby I used red wine and tea, and I really concentrated and layered up the red wine. So as it was drying, I was adding more and more and more and more to create this really sort of vibrant dark purple tone. Now when I did this, it was just the shapes. I didn't know what they were going to be. Like I did do grass on purpose, but I didn't know what the shapes were going to be until I started drawing and adding different definition and textures and layers. This technique also works with portraits. For this piece of Helen McKnockiter, what I will have done is draw in my outline first in pencil, and because she wears a lot of lace, I decided I'd make a background containing the lace. And this is coffee that I used, and then coloured pens. Yeah, so I think being mindful, getting drawing, and you don't have to have, you know, the most expensive gear or equipment. You don't even need to. It doesn't need to be good, and don't have a fear of the blank page. Just get started, get cracking, get drawing. Try and enjoy yourself. Try and keep it fun and playful. And these are just the things that you find in the house, but also I think there's other things you can use. You know, I think bleach is great because you can actually take the colour out of things with bleach. So you could use this and then use a little bit of bleach over the top and see what it does. You could use, I think, salt crystals could sort of, especially rock salt, what that would do is like lift the pigments off the paper, so you could use some of that. And you'd end up with like some blank bits, and you could like then draw and add details into that part. It's about playing and having a good time, and also doing what you want to do, making it, using your own creative voice, and building it up in layers, and just producing something that you feel proud of, but it'll help you as well mentally. Well, it does me anyway. Thank you very much for watching.